The boss pushed open the porch door on a rainy afternoon, and what he found inside stopped him cold in the doorway. His nurse was sitting on the floor. Her wrists were bound with yellow cargo rope, the kind they used down at the docks, the kind his own company imported by the 1,000 coil every month. The coffee table lay tipped on its side, papers scattered across the floor, every one of them read, past due, final and order. Somebody had torn that house apart, looking for something to hold over her, and what they'd found was poverty. But that wasn't what stopped Rowan Holloway. She looked up at him, and the first thing she did before crying out, before breathing, was shake her head. She was warning him. Someone was standing behind the door. 3 weeks earlier, beneath the gold light of an estate overlooking the bay, Rowan Holloway announced he would marry the woman all of Seattle called perfect. 200 glasses rose at once. Nobody noticed the woman on the second floor, standing in a dark hallway. Her hands trembling for a reason no one thought to ask about. Ron noticed. 3 nights later, unable to explain why he couldn't sleep, he drove out to find where she lived. What he found had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with surviving one night at a time. An old car parked at the bottom of a hill, a thin blanket folded on the back seat, and hanging from the rearview mirror, an employee badge that had expired 2 years ago. He didn't understand what that badge meant. It would take him 3 weeks to understand. And when he did, he would wish he had never opened a single door, because this woman had not wandered into his house by accident. She had come looking for him. Stay with me to the end. This story is only just beginning. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss next week's story. 3 weeks earlier, the largest house on Magnolia Hill blazed with light from the basement all the way to the roof. 200 cars lined the circular drive, their drivers waiting beneath the drizzle, while inside, a 4-piece string ensemble played the kind of music no one was truly listening to. Red wine had been flowing since 6 o'clock in the evening. People laughed together with the kind of laughter they had learned in private school. Everyone knew what Rowan Holloway was going to announce that night, and everyone pretended they didn't. But the story wasn't down there. It was on the second floor, at the end of a thickly carpeted hallway, behind the third door on the right. There was no music in that room. There was only the sound of the ventilator, steady and patient, 1 breath in and 1 breath out, like an old man counting time without needing to know what he was counting it for. Maren Voss dipped a cloth into the basin of warm water, wrung it dry, then wiped it slowly along Beckett Holloway's cheekbone. She moved with care, following the same order she had followed for 400 nights. First his forehead, then his temple, then his jaw, then his neck. The cloth was just warm enough. Never too hot, because his skin was thinner than the skin of a healthy man, and even a small red mark on his cheek would become an injury he couldn't scratch for himself. "You're lucky you didn't watch last night's game," she said. "The home team lost by 9 points. 9. That new quarterback throws the ball like he's tossing a garbage bag into a dumpster." Beckett blinked. "I'm serious. There was a play in the third quarter when he had 3 full seconds with no one chasing him and no one blocking his view. 3 seconds. Do you know how long 3 seconds is in football? It's a whole lifetime, and he still threw it out of bounds. Out of bounds, Beckett. I sat in my car screaming by myself like a lunatic." She stopped, realizing she had just revealed where she had watched the game. She lowered her head and wrung out the cloth again, and by the time she looked up, her voice had returned to normal. "Our team needs a quarterback who knows how to read the field. He doesn't need to throw far. He needs to know how to see." Beckett blinked twice. That was how he laughed. It had taken her 4 months to learn that. The doctors called his condition by a name long enough to fill an entire line. His family called him a second-floor problem. And during the 14 months Maren had spent in that room, she was the only person who had discovered that 2 blinks meant he found something funny, while 1 slow blink meant he was tired and she could keep talking if she wanted to, but she should speak softly. Downstairs, the music stopped. The entire room seemed to hold its breath for a single beat. Then a man's voice rose through the wooden floor, warped and indistinct, the words impossible to make out, leaving only the tone behind. Deep, brief, certain. It wasn't the voice of a man asking anyone's permission. And the applause crashed upward. It thundered through the floorboards, slipped beneath the legs of the bed, traveled along the metal frame. and Maren felt it in the palm of her hand as she held Beckett's wrist and counted his pulse. 200 people were celebrating, separated from her by a single layer of wood. Beckett turned his face toward the wall. Not much. He couldn't turn very far. It was only a slight movement of his chin, since 2 centimeters, the kind of movement 99 people out of 100 would never have noticed. Maren noticed. She said nothing. She didn't ask whether he was all right, because she knew that question was only another way of forcing someone to say that they were. She lowered his wrist, straightened the edge of his blanket, then stood and walked toward the window. That window hadn't been opened in 3 years. There was a medical reason for that, and there was another reason too. No one ever wrote in a patient chart. Maren released the latch, pushed the glass up by the width of a hand, and the November air poured in, damp and salty, carrying the scent of water from Elliott Bay below. On the window frame, the thing Maren had hung there on Saturday stirred gently. It was made from bottle caps. 9 bottle caps with holes punched through them, threaded onto fishing line and tied to a length of dry branch. The paint had peeled away in places. It wasn't a beautiful object, and it made no attempt to pretend that it was. The wind touched it. A sound rang out, clattering and uneven, forming no melody at all. It sounded nothing like the string music downstairs. It sounded nothing like anything else in that house. Beckett turned his face back. He didn't look at her. He looked toward the window frame, watching the bottle caps turn slowly in the darkness, and Maren stood motionless beside the bed, letting him look, letting that crooked clatter fill the room in place of the applause fading below. She didn't explain what it was. He didn't ask. They remained that way for about a minute. The ventilator breathed in, then out. The bottle caps tapped against one another. Downstairs, the band began to play again, and the laughter returned like water flooding into an empty space. Then the hallway light spilled into the room in one long streak. Maren turned. Sloane Kestrel stood in the doorway. She wore a black dress, her hair cut sharply at her chin like a declaration. Thin leather gloves fitted tightly around her wrists, even though the heat was on inside the house. She didn't step into the room. She had never stepped into that room. Her gaze moved from the open window to the bottle cap wind chime, then finally to Maren. Close the window. Maren reached for the window latch. She lowered the pane slowly, careful not to let it make a sound, and the bottle caps struck one another one last time before falling silent. Sloane remained standing in the doorway. She didn't step inside. She didn't need to. She only had to stand where the light was and let the room understand for itself who belonged in the darkness. "Come out here," she said. Maren set the basin of water on the table, wiped her hands against the front of her dress, then stepped into the hallway. Sloane didn't turn and walk away the way people usually did after giving an order. She waited. She waited until Maren had closed the door behind her, and only when the latch clicked into place did she begin to speak. Her voice was so quiet that Maren had to lean her head forward to hear clearly, something Maren would later realize was exactly what Sloane wanted. "Our guests don't need to hear machinery," Sloane said. "They didn't come here for that." Maren almost said that the window had only been open the width of a hand, that the sound of the ventilator couldn't possibly carry downstairs, that there was a 4-piece band below and 200 mouths speaking at once. She said nothing. She had learned that explaining was another form of talking back, and talking back cost more than she could afford. "Yes, ma'am." Sloane lowered her gaze to the floor. She stared for a long time at a place on the carpet where there was nothing at all. "The floor smells like medicine." Maren remained silent. "Can you smell it?" "Right here. This entire hallway." She drew a short breath through her nose, then exhaled, and the way she performed that small gesture made it clear that the odor wasn't alcohol or disinfectant. It was the smell of something inconvenient that had been allowed to remain in the house longer than necessary. "Clean it again. Tonight. Before the guests come upstairs." No one was coming upstairs. Not a single guest had set foot on the second floor of that house in 3 years. Maren knew it. Sloane knew it. And both women knew that the other knew. "Yes, ma'am." Sloane nodded slowly, like someone who had just reached a fair agreement with a business partner. Then she adjusted the glove on her left hand, pulling the edge of the leather snug against her wrist, and delivered her final sentence in a voice that was almost gentle. "I think sometimes you forget what you're being paid to do." Maren shrank into herself. "Not much." Her shoulders dropped only a fraction of an inch, her chin dipped slightly, and her hands folded automatically over her stomach. It was the kind of reflex the body learned after being spoken to in that voice. Some other times, the kind of reflex a woman couldn't turn off through willpower, because it didn't live in the will. It lived deeper than that, in a place reason couldn't reach. Sloane turned away. Her black dress swept across the carpet without a sound, and she walked towards the staircase with the bearing of a woman about to return to a party where she was the center of everything. At the top of the stairs, Rowan Holloway stood perfectly still. He had been there for about 20 minutes. He had come upstairs because he wanted to find his brother, because he wanted to say something to Beckett, though he hadn't yet decided what that something might be, and he had stopped when he saw two women standing at the far end of the dark hallway. He couldn't hear a word. More than 30 feet separated them. Their carpet was thick, and the voices below rose through the house like waves. He didn't know what Sloane had just said. He didn't know whether the window had been open or closed, what the floor smelled like, or who was right and who was wrong. He saw only one thing. He saw the shoulders of the woman in the nurse's uniform sink downward. He saw her hands fold themselves over her stomach. And he saw it happen quickly, neatly, expertly, without the slightest hesitation, in the way a movement could only become practiced after it had been repeated many, many times. Rowan Holloway had spent 18 years in a profession where reading another person's body mattered more than listening to their words. He knew what a person looked like when they were lying. He knew what a person looked like when they were about to run, and he knew exactly what the movement he had just witnessed meant. It meant this had happened before, many times. Sloane stepped onto the top stair and saw him. Her face changed for half a beat, not like someone who had been caught, but like someone who had suddenly remembered that the camera was still running. "Are you hiding from your own party?" she asked with a laugh, sliding her hand through the crook of his arm and pulling him downstairs. He let her lead him. Halfway down, he looked into the foyer. Below, among the black coats and raised wine glasses, a man stood near a stone column, his hair streaked with gray, his shoulders broad, his suit more expensive than it needed to be. Elias Ward. Rowan knew his face. Rowan also knew one other thing with absolute certainty. That name wasn't on the guest list, because Rowan himself had crossed it off 3 weeks earlier. Sloane released his arm at the bottom step up and walked toward Ward. She extended her hand. He took it. They shook hands like two people being introduced for the first time, smiling politely and nodding with perfect courtesy. Their hands remained joined for one beat too long. Only one beat. Not one of the 200 people in the foyer noticed. Rowan stood on the staircase with one hand resting on the wooden banister. And for the first time that entire evening, he wasn't thinking about his wedding. The last guest left the house at 1:40 in the morning. Rowan Holloway waited another hour and a half, sitting alone in his study with a glass of wine he never touched. Then he loosened his tie, left on the desk, and went down to the garage. He didn't call for a driver. At 3:20 in the morning, his black sedan descended Magnolia Hill, passing through wet streets glowing beneath yellow lamps, past the market that had already closed, then turning south toward the place where the city stopped being beautiful and began to work. Terminal 12 stood at the end of a road without sidewalks. No one slept there. The cranes were still turning, floodlights still burned white across the wet concrete, and shipping containers rose in rust-colored walls, stretching all the way to the water's edge. 4 o'clock in the morning at the port wasn't night. It was another kind of noon, another kind of people. In the small ground floor office of Warehouse 7, a man was sitting alone. His name was Curtis Pell. He was 49 years old, a warehouse manager who had worked for Holloway for 9 years. He sat in a plastic chair in the middle of the room with both hands resting on his thighs, and no one had tied him up. There was no need. 2 of Rowan's men leaned against the wall, not looking at him, their hands in their pockets, patient as pillars. The door opened. Rowan stepped inside, closed it behind him, and the sound of the cranes outside immediately fell away into a distant hum. He didn't look at Curtis right away. He looked around the small office, at the metal desk, at the wall calendar from a tire company, at the coffee mug with lettering that had nearly faded away. Then he pulled a second plastic chair from the corner, placed it opposite Curtis about 3 feet away, and sat down. He sat slightly lower because that chair sagged more deeply. He had chosen it on purpose. 9 years, Rowan said. His voice was ordinary, no louder than someone ordering breakfast. 9 years and 2 months, I believe, Mr. Holloway. Your wife's name is Denise. Curtis said nothing. Does she still work at the clinic on 45th Street? I heard back in March that she'd moved to the day shift. Curtis swallowed hard. Yes. She's still there, good. The day shift is much better. Rowan nodded sincerely, like two men speaking across a backyard fence. And your son? He still goes to school in the city, isn't he? Yes, is he doing well? He's doing well, sir. Good. Rowan allowed the silence to rest between them for about 5 seconds. During those 5 seconds, no one in the room moved. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and placed it on his lap without opening it. 6 months, he said. 22 shipments. You took about 4% from each one. A small amount. Small enough that no one would notice, and that's where I have to give you credit, Curtis. I truly do. Other men are greedier. Other men take 20% and disappear after 3 weeks. You were patient, you calculated. Curtis opened his mouth. Raised one finger. Only one. Curtis closed it again. I'm not asking why, Rowan said. I don't care why. Maybe your wife owes money. Maybe you lost it gambling. Maybe you simply thought I was rich enough that 4% wouldn't be worth turning my head for. All 3 of those are good reasons, and none of them changes anything. He leaned forward slightly, only slightly, and when he continued, his voice grew softer. So soft that the 2 men against the wall couldn't hear him. So soft that Curtis Pell had to tilt his head forward, which was exactly what Rowan wanted. Your son should grow up in a city where his father still lives, Rowan said. Not in a city where people speak about his father in the past tense. I want him to have a father, Curtis. I mean that sincerely. But whether he has one or not is no longer in my hands. It's in yours, and it's in the next 4 hours. Curtis began to tremble. It wasn't from the cold. 4 hours, Rowan said. Get out of Washington State. Don't go home for your belongings. Denise can send them later. Don't call anyone. If I hear your name in this city again, I won't come looking for you. He stood. He placed the folded paper on the metal desk, still without opening it. I'll find the people you owe money to, and I'll tell them where you are. They'll do the rest, and they won't be as polite as I am. Curtis Pell left that office at 4:12 in the morning. He didn't say thank you. People didn't say thank you in rooms like that. Only after the sound of his footsteps had completely disappeared across the yard did one of the men against the wall speak. His wife works at the clinic. If you want to make sure he doesn't come back, then. Rowan turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this one more time, he said. We never touch family. Not wives, not children, not elderly mothers. No one. Any man who touches an enemy's family is no longer one of mine. And he is no longer my problem either. He looked at the 2 men one at a time. This place has stood for 30 years. Not because we're stronger than everyone else, but because there's a line we don't cross, and everyone knows we don't cross it. The day we erase that line, every man in this city will understand that his home is no longer safe either. And when people have nothing left to lose, they become very dangerous. Rowan walked outside. The rain had stopped. Steam rose from the harbor beneath the floodlights, and he stood at the edge of the concrete and lit a cigarette, though he had quit 3 years earlier, then threw it away without taking a single drag. On the perimeter road running alongside the port fence, an old silver sedan crept past, moving slowly, its headlights weak, one taillight glowing brighter red than the other. Inside the car, Maren Voss was driving Beckett Halloway home from the hospital after a scan at 3 o'clock in the morning, because 3 o'clock in the morning was the only time they could schedule a patient who required 4 people to lift him. She drove slowly because the road was wet and because someone inside the car couldn't sit upright. She glanced to her right through the chain-link fence and she saw everything. 1 man running from the warehouse as though fleeing a fire. 2 men standing still and watching him leave without giving chase. And a 4th man, tall and dressed in a black coat, standing alone at the edge of the concrete amid the rising steam. Calm as someone who had just finished one task and was already waiting for the next. Maren recognized that posture. She had seen that same figure standing at the top of the staircase earlier that night, one hand resting on the wooden banister. She said nothing. She turned her eyes back to the road ahead, tightened both hands around the steering wheel, and in the rearview mirror, she saw Beckett Halloway looking out the window toward the port, his eyes open, without blinking even once. Rao Wan arrived home at 4:45 in the morning. The front lawn was still scarred with tire tracks. Several forgotten wine glasses sat on the windowsill holding rainwater. and a strip of white ribbon someone had tied to the fence the night before had come loose and lay draped across a bush like something abandoned. He went around to the kitchen door so he wouldn't have to walk past it. The house was dark. The cleaning staff had left at 3 o'clock. Sloane slept in the west wing and she never rose before 9. He took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and meant to go upstairs to his room as he did every night. He didn't go to his room. He stood at the foot of the staircase for nearly half a minute, one hand resting on the wooden finial at the end of the banister, and thought about an old car creeping past the port fence at 4 o'clock in the morning, one taillight glowing redder than the other. He didn't know why he remembered that detail. He went up to the second floor. The thick carpet swallowed every sound his footsteps made. The third door on the right stood slightly open, a narrow ribbon of yellow light slipping through, the glow of the small night lamp people left burning in rooms where nighttime didn't truly exist. He pushed the door open. The ventilator breathed in, then out. The basin had been emptied and the cloth had been folded into a neat square on the edge of the table. The blanket was drawn up to Beckett's chest, straight and smooth, without a single unnecessary wrinkle. Beckett Holloway lay, with his head turned toward the window, his eyes open. "You haven't slept," Rowan said. Beckett didn't turn toward him at once. It took him nearly 3 seconds to do what anyone else could have done in 1/10 of a second. And during those 3 seconds, Rowan stood in the middle of the room, with both arms hanging at his sides, not knowing where to put them. He pulled out the chair beside the bed. That chair was always in exactly the same place, turned at exactly the same angle, and he had never asked who put it there. He sat down. "I just came back from the port," Rowan said. "There was something I had to take care of." Beckett looked at him. "It's finished." "It was nothing." Beckett continued to look at him. Rowan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his 10 fingers interlaced. He couldn't count how many times he had sat in that chair over the past 3 years, but he knew that every time he did, he spoke about something outside that room, and he had never stayed longer than 15 minutes. "There were too many people here last night," he said. "I'm sorry about the noise." Then Beckett spoke. His voice was faint and slightly hoarse, and every word had to wait for the machine to push a breath into him before it could come out, so it sounded as though someone were reading a handwritten letter by candlelight. "What is her name?" Rowan looked up. "Whose?" "The nurse." Rowan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He knew what she looked like. He knew she wore her hair tied low, knew her nurse's uniform was a faded moss green, knew she always used the back door, and always removed her shoes on the step, even though no one had ever told her to. He knew she worked nights. He knew her signature appeared in the shift log, lying on the table exactly 5 feet from where he sat. He didn't know her name. 14 months. He had sat in this room, in the chair she herself had turned to that exact angle for him, and he didn't know her name. He thought about the shift log. He thought about reaching for it. He thought about how he would look doing that, in front of his brother at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he kept both hands still on his knees. The silence stretched on. The ventilator breathed in. The ventilator breathed out. Beckett turned his face away. He looked toward the window frame, where there was no wind now, where the bottle caps hung motionless and made no sound at all. "She's the only person in this house who asks me whether I'm in pain," Beckett said. Rowan didn't move. "People ask all the time. The doctors ask. The daytime nurses ask. You asked too during the first year." He paused to draw another breath, "but people ask, and then they keep talking. They don't wait. Because it takes me too long to answer, and everyone is busy." Another breath. "She waits." Rowan looked down at his hands. They were the hands that had signed things which made people leave the city within 4 hours. Now they rested on his knees and could do nothing at all. "Once it took me almost 2 minutes to say one word," Beckett said. 2 minutes, Rowan." She sat there in silence. She didn't guess for me. She didn't speak for me. She just sat there until I had finished. He didn't turn back. "Do you know what that feels like?" Rowan didn't answer. He stood. He rose slowly and carefully, like a man afraid of knocking something over, and he pushed the chair back into its original place, at its original angle, without realizing he had done it. He walked to the door. "Get some sleep," he said. Beckett didn't respond. Rowan closed the door behind him. Then he stood there in the dark hallway, his hand still resting on the doorknob. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, the thin gray light of a Seattle November, and it crept along the thick carpet toward his feet. At the far end of the hallway, The staircase led down into a house that had been filled with 200 people the night before. 200 people who knew his name. 200 people who had raised their glasses when he spoke. He stood outside that door for a very long time. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Rowan Holloway sat in his fourth-floor office overlooking the bay, and he opened something he hadn't opened once in 3 years. The household staff payroll system. It was buried in an obscure corner of internal accounting software, under household expenses, alongside the utility bills and lawn care payments. He had no reason to open it. He had 4 meetings that day, a port lease waiting for his signature, and an attorney who had been sitting in the hallway since 8:30. He entered his password and opened the file. The list appeared: gardener, chef, 2 housekeepers, driver, day nurse Roberta Finch, contracted through an agency. Then he saw the final line: Voss, M. long-term care nurse, night shift. He stared at the name for about 5 seconds. Voss. He repeated it silently once, then twice, and it stirred nothing in him. It was only a name sitting on a line of data, and that troubled him in a way he couldn't put into words. He clicked on it. 18 months of payroll appeared in a column of figures. He read from the bottom upward. From the first month through the 16th, the amount remained the same, steady and unchanging. 5 shifts a week every night, exactly like the one before it. Then, in the 17th month, the number dropped. It collapsed. 5 shifts became 2. In the 18th month, it was still 2. He opened the revision history. There was no note, no request. Nothing submitted by the employee. No performance review. Not a single line explaining why someone who had been working 5 nights had suddenly been reduced to 2. Only one field had been completed. Approved by Sloane Kestrel. Rowan sat perfectly still. On the glass, a container ship was being pulled slowly into its berth, enormous and ponderous, while gulls circled the cranes like drifting ash. He stared at the name on the screen and felt something rising inside his chest, something that 18 years earlier he would have allowed to climb straight into his throat and become a telephone call. He had learned that anger was the most expensive thing he could buy. He had learned that people didn't lose because they lacked strength. They lost because they acted before they understood. He didn't call Sloane. He picked up the telephone and dialed the accounting department's internal extension. Mr. Holloway. The voice belonged to Dale Whitmore, the chief accountant, 61 years old, who worked for the family since Rowan's father was alive. Dale. The woman who works nights at my house. Voss? Yes, sir. You know her. I've been signing her checks for 18 months, sir. Her shifts were cut to 2. Did you know about that? A brief silence came through the receiver, the silence of a man deciding how much he should say. I did, sir. The approval was valid, so I processed it. I'm not blaming you. Rowan turned his chair toward the window. I'm asking something else. Is she earning wages anywhere else? Another silence followed, longer than the first. Do you want me to look into it? You don't need to. You already know. Dale Whitmore exhaled into the receiver. West Shore Nursing Home, sir, down in Burien. She works the day shift. How many days? 6, sir. 6 days a week. Rowan said nothing. I know because last month she asked me for an income verification letter, Dale continued. She needed to submit it to some agency. I had to include both jobs on the same form, so that was when I saw it. Rowan looked down at the ship easing into its berth. Thank you, Dale. He set down the telephone. He lowered it very slowly and carefully, as though the receiver had become heavier than usual, and sat there working through a calculation he didn't want to make. 6 shifts in Burien. 2 night shifts in Magnolia. Burien was 40 minutes from his house without traffic, and there was always traffic in the afternoon. He tried to picture a week like that fitting into 7 days, and he couldn't. It didn't fit. It couldn't fit. Not unless something somewhere inside those 7 days had been taken away. He turned back to the screen. He reopened a personnel file for Voss, M., and scrolled down to the contact information. There was a telephone number. There was a social security number. There was an emergency contact, a woman in Tacoma. Permanent address. He stopped. The field was empty. He opened the revision history for that field, and the system returned a single line dated 7 months earlier, stating that the previous address had been deleted, and the person who had deleted it wasn't Sloane Kestrel. The person who had deleted it was Voss, M. for 3 nights later. Rowan Holloway couldn't sleep. He lay in the largest bedroom of the largest house on Magnolia Hill, staring at the ceiling for 2 straight hours, and the empty field in the personnel system appeared before him. Every time he closed his eyes, the previous address had been deleted. The person who deleted it was the employee herself. 7 months earlier. He got up at 2:40 in the morning. He dressed in the dark, went downstairs by the back staircase, and took the keys to the oldest car in the garage, the one no one would recognize. He didn't know where he intended to go. He only knew that tonight was one of the 2 nights she worked, and if she was working, then by 11 o'clock the next morning, she would have to be in Borean. And between those 2 things, there was a stretch of time Rowan couldn't make fit. He drove through the gate. The road winding around Magnolia Hill was steep and narrow, bordered by stone walls and rows of evergreens trimmed into perfect squares, by houses that revealed only their gates and never themselves. He drove downhill, he drove slowly. He didn't know what he was looking for until he saw it. At the foot of the hill, where the road bent around a curve and met a strip of vacant city land, there was a broad shoulder beneath 3 large maple trees. During the day, people parked there before walking down to the marina. At night, no one was ever there. Tonight, there was a car, an old silver sedan, an older model, the right side mirror held together with black tape, one taillight glowing redder than the other. Rowan pulled over about 100 feet away beneath the trees and turned off the engine. He sat still. 400 yards. That was the distance from this place to the gate of his house. He knew the number because he had walked that road thousands of times as a boy. The windows of the silver car were clouded white with condensation. Not in one corner. All of them. All 4 windows. The kind of moisture that only gathered that way when a living body had been breathing inside a sealed space for many hours. Rowan sat in his own car with both hands resting on the steering wheel, and he watched. In the driver's seat, reclined as far back as it would go, a figure lay curled on one side with her face turned toward the seatback. A thin plaid blanket, the kind sold in auto supply stores, was pulled up to her shoulders. A coat had been rolled into a pillow. On the passenger seat sat a half-empty bottle of water. Beside the bottle was a small box of medicine, the kind printed with playful pictures so children wouldn't be afraid to look at it. It sat neatly with the lid closed, placed where it could be reached most easily. Rowan stared at that box longer than he meant to. In the back seat, arranged neatly along one side, were several full bags, not suitcases. Cloth bags, shopping bags, one backpack, packed neatly, lined up straight, placed in the careful order of someone who had packed them many times before. He had considered possibilities while driving down the hill. He had thought perhaps she was staying with someone. Perhaps she had moved to a cheaper neighborhood and felt embarrassed to put it in her records. Perhaps there was an ex-husband, a restraining order, some legitimate reason for a woman to erase her address from every document. He hadn't considered this possibility. He hadn't considered that when her shift ended at 7 o'clock in the morning, that woman would walk 400 yards down the hill, climb into this car, drive 40 minutes to Borean, work a day shift, then drive back, and park in this exact place again. Not because it was beautiful, because it was close. Because 400 yards was a distance an exhausted person could still walk at 11 o'clock at night. The glass moved. No, not the glass, her breath. Every few seconds, a fresh patch of fog spread across the inside of the window, then faded, then spread again. Rowan watched it appear and disappear, and he didn't move. He could get out of the car. He could walk 100 feet and knock on the window. He could say something, anything. And within an hour he could place this woman in an apartment with heat, a locking door, and a bed. He could do it more easily than almost anyone else in the world. He didn't get out. He sat there for 40 minutes. He didn't allow himself to call it kindness, because he knew it wasn't. He remained still because he understood, with a clarity that was both sharp and deeply uncomfortable, that if he knocked on that window at 3 o'clock in the morning, the first thing the woman inside would feel wouldn't be gratitude. It would be fear. And after the fear, when she realized it was him, the next thing would be humiliation, and he would be the one placing it on her shoulders, and he would never be able to lift it off again. So he sat, 3:20, 3:40, a few minutes before 4. The rain began again, light and almost soundless, and the windows of the silver sedan slowly blurred from both sides. Then Rowan saw it. Hanging from the rearview mirror inside her car was something that swayed gently. It wasn't an air freshener shaped like a pine tree. It wasn't a string of prayer beads. It was a rigid plastic card, the size of an employee badge, threaded onto a frayed cloth lanyard. From where he sat, he couldn't read the words. He could only see a streak of color, a small rectangular photograph, and at the bottom a bold printed strip that he guessed was the expiration date. He narrowed his eyes. That strip, he thought, showed a date from 2 years earlier. People didn't hang employee badges from their rearview mirrors. They kept them in a wallet, or in a drawer, or threw them away on the day they no longer needed them. They didn't hang them where they would have to see them every time they raised their eyes. Rowan Holloway sat in his car beneath the maple trees, watching that card turn slowly in the darkness, and he didn't understand what it meant. Saturday brought a break in the weather. In Seattle in November, a break meant the clouds lifted a little higher, and the rain fell only twice during the day instead of all day long. Rowan Holloway had been sitting in the old car beneath the maple trees since before 7 o'clock, and at 7:15, the silver sedan's engine started. He had no intention of following her. He told himself that for exactly 4 seconds, then turned the key. The sedan didn't head toward Borean. It entered Interstate 5 and traveled south, past the airport, past low industrial buildings, past the long overpass stretching across gray water, while Rowan stayed 4 cars behind for 45 minutes without understanding what he was doing. At the Tacoma exit, the silver car turned right. It entered an old residential neighborhood, where maple trees along the streets had shed every leaf, and single-story, wooden houses were painted pale yellow and pale blue, each with a yard no larger than a rug, children's bicycles resting on porches, and team flags hanging beside front doors. It wasn't a poor neighborhood. It was the kind of neighborhood inhabited by people who had paid off their mortgages 30 years earlier and had no intention of going anywhere else. The silver sedan slowed in front of a butter-yellow house with a low white wooden fence, not even waist-high, the kind of fence that couldn't keep anyone out and existed only to say that this was someone's home. Rowan pulled over 4 houses away beneath a maple tree and shut off the engine. The silver car's door opened. Maren Voss stepped out. She wore a gray sweater instead of her nursing uniform, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she stood beside the car for nearly 3 seconds doing something. Rowan didn't immediately understand. She straightened the hem of her sweater. She smoothed back her hair. She drew a deep breath, held it, then slowly let it out. Then she changed. It wasn't her face that changed. It was her whole body. Her shoulders lifted, her chin rose, and when she stepped through the white wooden gate, she walked with the posture of someone who had slept a full 8 hours in a bed with a mattress. The front door flew open before she reached the porch steps. A scream rang out. It wasn't crying, and it wasn't someone calling her name. It was the kind of scream only a child could make, the kind that emptied every bit of air in the lungs for something joyful and saved nothing for what came afterward. A 6-year-old girl burst through the doorway, burst across the tiny yard, and leaped, truly leaped. Her entire body left the ground, both arms spread wide, and Maren caught her in midair with the ease of someone who had caught her hundreds of times and knew without doubt that she wouldn't miss. The force of it spun her around once. The little girl shrieked with laughter. "Mommy, mommy, 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 mommy. Oh my goodness, you're getting too heavy. I'm not heavy. You're as heavy as a refrigerator. Refrigerators can't talk, that's right. Refrigerators can't talk. You talk all the time." Wynne slid back to the ground and immediately grabbed her mother's hand, pulling hard, using the weight of her whole body, toward the porch steps. "Mommy, mommy, I finished it." "Finished what?" "Thing. The thing I told you about." The little girl ran inside, disappeared for nearly 4 seconds, then came racing back out, with something pressed against her chest as though she were carrying a cat. It was a dry branch. Hanging from it were 9 bottle caps with holes punched through them, threaded onto fishing line, each one suspended at a different length. The blue and red paint was chipped and smeared, and one cap was bent along one side because someone had punched the hole a little too forcefully. Wynne held it up and shook it. It clattered crookedly, forming no melody at all. "Did you hear it?" "I heard it." Maren sat down on the porch step until she was level with the child's eyes. "Where did you make this?" "In craft class. Miss Dunn let me take bottle caps from the box. I took 9 because 9 is a beautiful number." "9 is a beautiful number?" "Yes, because it's the last number." Maren nodded with complete seriousness. "That makes sense, Mommy. What is it?" "Take this to the man in the big house." Maren paused. "Which man?" "The one you told me about. The one who has to lie still. The one you said you tell football stories to." "Oh, that man. Take it to him, Mommy." "Why should I take it to him?" Wynne shrugged in the way people shrugged when the answer was so obvious that it hardly deserved to be spoken aloud. Because you said there is a machine in his room that makes noise all day. Beep, 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 all night long. The little girl imitated the machine with a solemn expression. Listening to that all the time must be terribly boring. He needs to hear something that isn't a machine, Mommy. Marin adds nothing for 2 seconds. Then she picked up the wind chime, held it toward the light, turned it once, and assumed the expression of an expert, making a careful evaluation. This is definitely not a machine. It's not a machine. These are bottle caps. They're bottle caps. All right, I'll take it. The little girl thrust both fists into the air as though she had just scored. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway, carrying a plate of cookies, set it down on the porch step between mother and daughter, then went back inside without saying a word, in the way grandmothers knew when they should be present and when they shouldn't. Wynne ate her cookie by nibbling all the way around the edge before eating the middle. Marin did exactly the same. The little girl told her about a boy named Gus, who had lost one shoe on the playground, and how the entire class had to search for it. She told her that Miss Dunn owned a brooch shaped like a turtle. She told her that Grandma had made some squash soup and claimed squash was for the eyes, though Wynne believed Grandma had simply made that up. Marin listened to every word. She didn't look at the time once. She asked questions in exactly the right places, laughed in exactly the right places, and not once during those 40 minutes on the porch did anyone ask Mice where she had slept the night before, because no one inside that house knew it was a question that needed to be asked. 4 houses away, beneath the maple tree, Rowan Holloway sat in his car. He watched the 2 heads leaning close together on the porch step, one covered in ash-blonde hair, the other smaller. He watched the bottle cap wind chime, resting against the base of the porch post. He didn't get out of the car, not because he lacked the courage. Because he understood that there were moments the presence of a man like him would ruin, not because he would do anything cruel, but simply because he would exist there, and that wooden porch was one of the places where he had no right to set foot. He drove back to Seattle at 11 o'clock. He told no one where he had been. That night, at around 9 o'clock, Rowan Holloway entered the 3rd room on the right side of the 2nd floor. Beckett was awake. Rowan didn't sit in the chair. He walked straight to the window, released the latch, and pushed the pane open about the width of a hand. The November air poured inside, damp and salty. The bottle cap wind hanging from the frame stirred, then began to clatter, crooked and uneven, forming no melody at all. Beckett turned his head and looked at his brother. Rowan didn't explain anything. He simply stood there with one hand still resting on the window frame and allowed the thing to make its sound. The following Tuesday night, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Marin Voss ran out of clean cloths. She had used the last one at midnight. The linen closet on the 2nd floor held only several large bath towels, the kind that wouldn't work for what she needed to do, and she still had 3 hours before Beckett would need to be changed one final time during her shift. She picked up the stainless steel instrument tray, placed the used items inside it, and went downstairs. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the house possessed a silence all its own. It wasn't the silence of rest. It was the silence of something too large, with too many empty rooms and too many hallways no one ever walked through. Marin descended the back staircase, supporting the tray with her left hand and guiding herself along the wall with her right, because she hadn't turned on the lights. She had taken this route 400 times, and she knew the 9th step creaked if she placed her foot in the middle. The laundry room was at the end of the ground floor hallway, beyond the kitchen and beside the back door. It was a long, narrow room with white-tiled walls, 2 industrial washing machines, and a row of linen cabinets reaching all the way to the ceiling. Fluorescent lights, the kind of light that made everyone's skin look sick. The laundry room door stood slightly open. Light spilled through the gap. Marin stopped 3 steps away. The housekeepers had left at 10 o'clock. The chef had left at 9. No one came down here at 2 in the morning. Then she heard a voice. No, I said it's the 22nd. The 22nd, not the 21st, Sloane's voice. But it wasn't the Sloane the rest of the house knew. This was Fester and Lower Bester, stripped of the smooth softness she wore like a pair of gloves. This voice was urgent. Container 4829. 4829. Write it down. Marin stood still. She knew the proper thing to do was turn around. Go back upstairs. Forget. She also knew her feet weren't moving. It reaches Terminal 18 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The truck leaves the port at around 4, takes the southern perimeter road, and doesn't pass the way station. It must never pass the way station. A pause. I know it's urgent. Do you think I don't know that? Another pause, longer this time. Then her voice changed. It dropped, not in volume but in tension, like a wire pulled almost to the breaking point. Don't speak to me that way, Elias. Don't you dare speak to me that way. The tray slipped from Ren's hands. It struck the tiled floor, and it didn't fall quietly. Stainless steel slammed against ceramic, bounced, then struck again, and in the 2 o'clock silence of that house, the sound cracked through the hallway like a slap. Inside the room, the voice stopped instantly. Maren bent down. She didn't bend because she had thought of a plan. She bent because her body moved before her mind could tell it what to do. The laundry room door opened wide. Sloane Kestrel stood in the doorway beneath the fluorescent light. She wore a charcoal silk robe and soft slippers, her hair falling across one cheek, and she didn't look like someone who had just been caught. She looked like someone who had just been told she had a visitor. The phone was still in her hand. The screen was still lit. She didn't turn it off. Very slowly she turned and looked down at the woman, kneeling on one knee on the tiled floor. The two women stared at each other. Neither spoke. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, the kind of hum people only heard when everything else had gone silent. Maren could hear her heart. She could hear it inside her ears. She waited for the question. She had prepared her answer from the instant the tray struck the floor, that she had come down for clean cloths, that she hadn't heard anything, that she was in a hurry. She had arranged those words in the proper order inside her head, and practiced the voice that would make them sound ordinary. Sloane didn't ask. That was the one thing Maren hadn't expected. If Sloane asked, it would mean she wasn't certain. If Sloane shouted, if she snatched away the tray, if she threatened her, it would mean Sloane was afraid. Sloane only stood there. Then she smiled. There was nothing wrong with the smile. It was a kind smile. The smile of someone meeting a colleague in an elevator, and because there was nothing wrong with it, a chill traveled down Maren's spine. It's late, Sloane said. Her voice had returned, soft, smooth, gloved. Yes, ma'am. Your shift ends at 7 o'clock? Yes, Sloane nodded. She stepped aside and politely cleared the way into the laundry room like someone holding a door open for another person to pass through. It's cold tonight, she said. They say it will fall below 40 degrees. Make sure you put on another layer, yes. When your shift is over, go home and get some sleep. Maren picked up the tray. She gathered each item that had scattered across the floor, the forceps, the box of gauze, the cap from a bottle, and placed them back in the tray in precisely the same order because her hands needed something to do. Yes, ma'am. Sloane watched her. Then she spoke one final sentence, still in that same voice, still wearing that same smile, without placing emphasis on a single word. If you have a home. Maren didn't look up. She rose, held the tray against her stomach, and walked into the laundry room. She opened the cabinet. She took 6 clean cloths. She folded them over her arm exactly as she always did. She closed the cabinet. She walked out, past Sloane, who was still standing there, and thanked her, wished her good night, in the steady voice of an employee doing her job at 2 o'clock in the morning. She went upstairs by the back staircase. She avoided the 9th step. Halfway up in the darkness, she stopped and rested her forehead against the cold wall for about 5 seconds. She didn't allow herself more than 5 seconds. Then she continued, because she understood now. Sloane hadn't asked what she had heard. Sloane didn't need to ask. And that final sentence hadn't been a cruel remark that slipped out at 2 o'clock in the morning. It had been a notice. It meant that the woman had known for a long time that when Maren Voss finished her shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, she had nowhere to go. Sloane had known, and she hadn't told anyone, and she had stored that knowledge somewhere neat and patient, the way someone placed a knife inside a drawer instead of throwing it away. She had kept it there until this very night, waiting for the right moment to take it out and lay it on the table. West Shore Nursing Home stood in Burien, inside a 2-story building constructed in the 1970s, with brown brick walls, square windows, and a row of roses planted along the entrance by someone no one could remember. Inside were 38 rooms, a common room with a Christmas tree the staff had put up at the beginning of November because Alma Reyes in room 12 liked looking at it, and a smell. That smell existed in every nursing home across America. the scent of disinfectant mixed with laundered fabric and chicken soup, and it clung to people's hair so thoroughly that the employees there could no longer smell it. At 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Maren Voss was drying her hands at a sink in the first-floor hallway when the receptionist called to her. "Maren, someone is here to see you." "Who?" She didn't give her name. "She's in the common room," Maren knew. She knew before she reached the doorway. Sloane Kestrel sat in one of the orange vinyl chairs in the common room beneath the Christmas tree that had been raised too early, and she looked so completely out of place there that it was almost absurd. Camel-colored wool coat, thin leather gloves. She sat with her back straight, her knees together, and both hands resting on a cream paper bag placed across her lap, smiling at Mr. Doyle at the next table, who was working on a 700-piece puzzle he had been assembling for 2 years. "Hello, Miss Voss," Sloane said. Maren didn't sit down. "Please sit. I won't take long." Maren sat. Sloane opened the paper bag. She removed a thin file, stapled at the corner, and placed it on the plastic table between them. She didn't push it toward Maren. She simply set it down and turned it until it lay perfectly straight, carefully, as though she were placing a greeting card. The first page was a copy of Maren's professional license. Her photograph had been taken when she was 23. Registration number, seal of the Washington State Licensing Board, most recent renewal date. Maren looked at it, and for 1 second she couldn't understand why seeing her own document made her stomach turn so cold. Sloane turned the page. The second sheet was a complaint form. It had been typed in full. It carried the correct heading, the correct form number, a space for the date, a description of the incident about 2 paragraphs long, and spaces for the complainant's name and signature. The date was blank. The signature was blank. Every other field had already been completed. "It hasn't been submitted," Sloane said. Maren didn't lift her eyes from the paper. "I want you to read it carefully, not because I'm trying to frighten you, because I want you to understand exactly what is sitting on this table. I believe you're an intelligent woman, and intelligent people deserve to see the whole thing." She waited. Maren read. The 2 paragraphs stated that during certain shifts, the nurse responsible had left her assigned station, had allowed a patient to remain without direct supervision for an unspecified period of time, and had shown signs of impaired caregiving ability caused by working beyond the permitted number of hours at several facilities simultaneously. Every word could be proven. Every word was true, and arranged beside one another in that way, they formed something entirely different from the truth. "You understand what this is, don't you?" Sloane asked gently. "I don't need to prove that you harmed anyone. I don't need a court. I only need the board to open a case. Do you know how long they take to review one?" Maren knew. 14 months to 2 years. "And while they review it, your license is suspended. Suspended, not revoked. It sounds almost harmless. It means you aren't allowed to touch a patient. Not here. Not in my house. Not anywhere in this state." She paused in exactly the right place. "And after 2 years, if they conclude there was nothing to it, your license is restored. But by then you'll be 31. You will have spent 2 years out of practice, and there will be a line in your record that every employer can see." At the next table, Mr. Doyle found a puzzle piece and tapped it softly against the tabletop, pleased with himself. "What do you want?" Maren asked. Those were the first words she had spoken since sitting down. Sloane tilted her head slightly, as though the question had disappointed her. "I don't want anything. I'm not asking you to do anything for me. I only want everything to remain exactly as it is." She tapped one gloved finger against the file once. "You go to work. You care for your patient. You do that very well, and I mean that sincerely. I'm not being sarcastic. And you don't speak to anyone about things that have nothing to do with your work." Then she said the sentence Maren would think about for a very long time afterward, and Maren would misunderstand it for weeks, just as anyone sitting in that orange vinyl chair that afternoon would have misunderstood it. Sloane didn't say it in a threatening voice. She said it softly and quickly, and something very thin passed across her face before disappearing too quickly to take shape. I'm only protecting my family, Miss Voss." She stood. She picked up the file, returned it to the paper bag, and folded the top edge down twice until it was flat. I'll keep this at home," she said, "in a drawer. You can rest assured that it will remain there." She greeted Mr. Doyle with perfect politeness. She complimented the Christmas tree. Then she walked out, her heels tapping evenly across the vinyl floor, through the glass doors and into the parking lot, where a black car collected her and drove away. Marin rose. She walked into the hallway. She stood there between the numbered doors from 1 through 15, beneath ceiling lights that always looked slightly yellow, while that smell surrounded her, disinfectant mixed with laundered fabric and chicken soup, the smell she had breathed every day for 8 years and could no longer detect. The call bell rang in room 7. She wiped her palms against the front of her dress twice, then walked toward it. But Sloane Kestrel wasn't the thing that broke Marin Voss. The file inside the cream paper bag had only frightened her, and Marin had lived with fear for so long that it had become nothing more than a kind of weather. The thing that broke her arrived on Friday afternoon, and it was an envelope. She collected it from the post office box she rented by the month, box now 217 at the Rainbow Street post office, the only place left in the world that still counted as Marin Voss's address. She unlocked the little metal door, and there it was, a large brown envelope nearly as thick as the first joint of a finger, with no logo and no return name, only a Spokane postmark and a line of slanted handwriting she recognized from 6 feet away. She stood before the rows of metal boxes for nearly 10 seconds, one hand still resting on the small door, and she didn't pick it up immediately. The man who had sent it was named Harlan Boyd. He was 67 years old and had spent 30 years as an insurance investigator before opening his own private office on the 2nd floor of a building in Spokane, and he was the only person in the past 2 years who had answered Marin's telephone calls without telling her that she needed to let it go. She had gone to him in the 4th month after every official door had closed. The fire department had reached its conclusion. The insurance company had reached its conclusion. The police department had closed the file with a single line, stating that there was no evidence of criminal activity. Everyone had reached a conclusion, and no one had answered her question, and her question was so small that everyone who heard it looked at her with pity. Harlan Boyd hadn't looked at her that way. He had asked 3 questions, written the answers in a notebook, then told her that it would take time and cost money, and he had named the amount during their very first meeting because he didn't want anyone borrowing money without knowing what they were borrowing it for. Marin had known. She sold the apartment in Ballard the following March. It was a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor, with one window overlooking the parking spaces, a pencil's mark on the kitchen doorframe recording Wynn's height when she was 4 years old. She sold it to a young married couple, and she stood in the empty room one final time with her phone in her hand, took a photograph of that pencil mark, then locked the door. The money from the sale paid off the old debt and left some behind. What remained was gone within 11 months. After that came the credit cards. Then the first loan, then the second loan with an interest rate no sane person would ever have agreed to, and by the spring of this year, the total had reached $96,000. People looked at a number like that and thought of hospitals, bills, accidents. No one imagined that a woman could dig a hole that deep with her own hands, one shovelful at a time, over 2 years, by paying an old man in Spokane to keep asking the questions the entire state had stopped asking. It was raining on Friday afternoon. Not the usual Seattle rain, that fine mist that fell all day, without anyone bothering to cover their head. This was real rain, heavy drops drumming steadily against the roof of the car. Marin climbed into the driver's seat, closed the door, and for 3 seconds the car hung a sealed metal box, surrounded by the sound of water. She placed the envelope on the steering wheel. She looked at it. 2 years. She had imagined this moment so many times that it almost felt as though it had already happened. She slipped one finger beneath the edge of the paper and tore it open. There were several pages inside. She pulled them out. She read. The rain continued striking the roof, steady and unchanging, never missing a beat, and inside that metal box, a woman was reading while no one in the world could see her. She finished the first page. She turned it over. She read the second more slowly than the first, much more slowly, and halfway down the page she stopped, returned to the top, and began again. She read it a 3rd time. The blood drained from her face. It truly drained away, and anyone watching could have seen it happen. The color leaving her cheeks and then her lips, until all that remained was a paper-pale face beneath the gray light of a rainy Friday afternoon. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. Her left hand released the paper and found the steering wheel, gripping it tightly until her knuckles turned white. And she remained that way for a very long time, her left hand clenched around the wheel, her right hand holding the pages, her eyes open and staring through the windshield at an empty parking lot she couldn't see. Then she folded them. She did it very slowly. Folded them in half. Pressed the crease flat with her thumb, twice, then 3 times, carefully, like someone completing a delicate craft that demanded precision. She returned them to the envelope. Folded down the flap. Then she placed on the passenger seat beside the water bottle and the small box of medicine printed with playful pictures. She lifted her head. The plastic card hanging from the rear-view mirror swayed and turned slowly, and she watched it for about 5 seconds. Reached it into the back seat, pulled forward the backpack, and took out a hardbound notebook and a ballpoint pen. She turned to a blank page. She rested the notebook on the steering wheel. She wrote the date in the upper right corner. Then she wrote the first line, "Dear Mr. Halloway." She stopped. She crossed out Mr. Halloway. She began again. "Dear Halloway Household Management, I am writing to submit my resignation effective." Her pen stopped after the word effective. It remained there for nearly 15 seconds, ink gathering into a small round stain on the paper, and her shoulders began to tremble, and this time she couldn't stop them, and she bent forward until her forehead rested against the back of the hand holding the pen, while the rain pounding against the roof of the car covered everything. Someone knocked on the window. Maren jerked her head up. Outside the window, through the streams of rainwater running down the glass, a figure stood there. She didn't recognize him at once. She pressed herself back against the seat, her right hand instinctively snatching the envelope from the passenger seat and pushing it beneath her thigh, and only then did she look more closely. Rowan Halloway stood outside without an umbrella or a hat. She didn't know how long he had been there, but his hair was plastered to his forehead. The dark wool coat across his shoulders was soaked deeply enough to have changed color, and water ran in thin streams along his jaw before falling away. He didn't knock a second time. He only stood there. Maren lowered the window by the width of a hand. "Mr. Halloway, can you unlock the door?" It wasn't a question. It had the shape of a question, but it wasn't one. She pressed the lock. He walked around the front of the car, opened the passenger door, and sat down. He was soaked through, and within 3 seconds, the old car was filled with the smell of rain and wet wool. He had to lower his head because the roof was too low for him. His knees touched the glove compartment. That man inside that car looked so completely wrong that it was almost funny, and neither of them laughed. He said nothing for a long time. He stared straight ahead through the windshield at the empty parking lot of the Rainbow Street post office and exhaled once. Then he looked toward her. He didn't look at her face at first. He looked at the notebook lying open across the steering wheel, the date in the upper right corner. "Dear Halloway Household Management, I am writing to submit my resignation, effective." And the round dot of ink gathered at the end of the word effective. He read it for about 4 seconds. Maren didn't close the notebook. She had meant to, and then she didn't, and she didn't know why. "No," Rowan said. She looked up. "What did you just say?" "I said no." He turned fully toward her. In the cramped space from less than 2 feet away, she could clearly see the thin scar running along his left cheekbone, something no one could see from the top of a staircase or across a hallway. "You're not resigning." Something rose into Maren's throat, and she realized with some surprise that it was anger. "You don't have the right, I know. Then, I'm still saying no." He didn't raise his voice. He hadn't raised it once in his adult life, and he didn't need to. "Listen until I'm finished. You have 11 days. From now till the 22nd you work as usual. You tell no one about this, and you don't ask me a single question, Mr. Halloway. 11 days. After that, everything in that house will be different. I can't explain it to you now, and I won't apologize for not explaining." He delivered the sentences the way a man read the terms of a contract. There was nowhere for her to interrupt. There was no space to negotiate. He didn't take her hand. He didn't soften his voice into the gentle tone men used when they wanted something. He simply sat there drenched inside her old car and gave an order. "And your debt," he said. "I'll take care of it." Maren went rigid. "My what?" "You know what I'm talking about, you." She stopped. She heard her voice beginning to tremble, and she hated that more than anything else that had happened in the past 30 seconds. "You investigated me? I reviewed the payroll records of my own household. Then I asked one question, Voss, and the answer left me sitting in silence for 10 minutes, and he looked directly into her eyes. You work 6 days in Burien. You work 2 nights at my house. I've added up that week again and again, and it doesn't fit. Do you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't fit inside 7 days, Marin didn't answer. So I'm asking you one question, and then this is the only question I'm asking. Where do you sleep? Rain hammered against the roof, steady and relentless. She looked at him. And this was the moment when everything inside her turned in a direction Rowan Holloway couldn't see, couldn't predict, and had no clue existed. Because 15 minutes earlier, this woman had finished reading the papers she was now holding beneath her own thigh. She looked at the scar on his cheekbone. She looked at his rain-soaked hair. She looked at the man who had driven some unknown distance through the storm to stand outside her window, without an umbrella. The man who has just told her he would take care of it. The man sitting there with his knees pressed against the glove compartment, behaving as though he could repair everything in the world. And she saw a name. Not the name he had just spoken. Another name, written in ink near the bottom corner of one of the pages beneath her thigh. Something very strange passed across her face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. Rowan had spent 18 years reading people's faces, and he couldn't read this one. It was like watching someone realize that the room they were standing in wasn't the room they had believed it to be. Mr. Holloway, she said very softly. There's something you should know about me. Tell me, I'm very good at choosing the wrong people to save. He frowned. I don't understand. No, she said. You don't. She raised one hand and closed the notebook. She did it gently, without finality, and left her hand resting on the cover for about 2 seconds. Then she placed it inside the backpack. 11 days, she said. Yes, all right. Rowan looked at her. He had prepared himself for an argument. He had prepared for tears, for refusal, for the need to speak more firmly. He hadn't prepared for her to agree so quickly, and for one brief moment inside that cramped, rain-soaked car, Rowan Holloway felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt as though he had just won a game whose rules he didn't know. He opened the car door and stepped back into the rain. He bent down and looked inside through the partially lowered window. You haven't answered my question. No, Marin said. I haven't. She watched him walk through the rain toward the old car, parked about 100 feet away, his head uncovered. She waited until his taillights had disappeared completely around the curve. Then she pulled the brown envelope from beneath her thigh and held it in both hands. She would stay, not because he had ordered her to, not because of the 11 days, and not because of the money. She would stay because she had spent 2 years searching for an answer, and now she held it in her hands, only to discover that even with it, something was still missing. She had one more question, and there was only one person in the world who could answer it. People often think debt is something that stays still. It doesn't. It is bought and sold. When a loan can't be repaid, the bank sells it to the first collection company for 4 cents on the dollar. That company collects part of it, then sells what remains to a second company for 15 cents. And so it continues, falling lower and lower, passing from one pair of hands to another, and every time it changes owners, the number remains the same, while the person standing behind it has less and less to lose. Rowan Holloway knew how that worked because his family had operated at both ends of that chain for 30 years. He didn't need an attorney to investigate it. He called Dale Whitmore at 7 o'clock on Saturday evening and said exactly one sentence, then sat in his 4th-floor office until Dale called back at 10. It's done, sir. Tell me. $96,210. It was divided into 3 pieces. The largest piece is held by a company called Cascade Recovery Partners, down in Kent. They own the other 2 smaller pieces as well. They consolidated them in August of last year. How much did they pay for it? I spoke to someone in the industry. On average, they pay about 9 cents on the dollar for accounts like this. Rowan calculated it in his head. 9 cents. $9,000. $9,000 was the amount that had kept a woman sleeping in her car for 7 months. Who runs it? A man named Barry Kessler. He owns 4 identical companies registered at 4 different addresses, but in reality, they all operate from one office above an auto repair shop. Can you buy it from him? Yes. Accounts like this are sold all the time. But sir, Dale hesitated, in the voice of a 61-year-old man who had signed checks for this family too long not to recognize what he was seeing. If all you want is to erase it, we can pay them the full principal and interest and be finished in 2 hours. Why buy it? Because paying them means giving them 10 times what they paid, Rowan said. And I don't give anyone a 10-fold profit for doing what they have done to her for the past 2 years. Yes, buy it, Dale. Offer them 11 cents. They'll sign immediately. And I want every call record attached to the account. The law requires them to keep those records. Tell them to hand over everything. At Hooten on Sunday morning, Rowan Hackledrones Halloway sat alone in his fourth-floor office with every light off except one desk lamp, and before him lay a stack of printed pages nearly 3 finger joints thick. It was the call log, time, duration. He had before 4 hours, 340 calls. Over 2 years, he had read every line, and he hadn't skipped a single one, and that was why he was still sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning. A call at 6:15 in the morning. A call at 9:40 at night. A call on the 1st of January. There was a sequence of 11 calls in a single day, each one spaced about 40 minutes apart, from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 in the evening, and Rowan looked at the date, opened his calendar, and discovered that it had been a Saturday. He knew what she did on Saturdays. He picked up the telephone and dialed the number. It rang 9 times. "What is it?" A man's voice, groggy and irritated. "Mr. Kessler? Who is this? Do you know what time it is?" 2:16 in the morning, Rowan said. "Am I disturbing you?" A rustling sound, the sound of someone sitting up in bed. "Who are you?" "I am the new owner of the account under the name Voss. As of Saturday afternoon, I assume your office hasn't had time to inform you." Silence. "Listen, if you want to dispute the sale, call during business hours. I'm not disputing anything. I bought it. I'm calling because I just finished reading all 340 of them. 340. "What calls, Mr. Kessler?" "Your employees called this woman 340 times over 2 years. I have records of all 340. The law required you to retain them, and you kept them very carefully, and now they are sitting on my desk." The voice on the other end changed. It was fully awake now. "We followed the regulations. We never exceeded the permitted number of calls within 7 days, correct?" "You didn't. I checked." "Your employees are very skilled." Rowan turned a page. "But there is something the law doesn't forbid that I happen to notice. On June 14th of last year, you called 11 times in one day. 1 call every 40 minutes, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. That was a Saturday, Mr. Kessler. So what?" "So it means someone in your office took the time to discover that Saturday was the only day of the week this woman had off. And you chose that exact day." Silence. Rowan could hear the man's breathing through the receiver. "Mr. Kessler, I have no intention of suing you. Lawsuits take time, and I don't like things that take time. I called to tell you 3 things." He spoke very slowly and very clearly, in the ordinary voice of someone reading from a menu. "First, the Voss account no longer exists. Neither you nor any of your employees will ever speak that name again. Second, I have the records of all 340 calls, and I will keep them. Not to use them, only to keep them." A pause. "Third, I also have your home address. Your real house in Auburn, not the 4 registered addresses written on paper. I have it because it was included in the files you sold me. You gave it to me yourself. I didn't go looking for it." The voice on the other end began to tremble. "What are you planning to do?" "Nothing," Rowan said. "I will never set foot there. I don't do things like that, and I don't allow my people to do them either. I am telling you the 3rd thing, only because I want you to sit in the darkness tonight and think about what it feels like to know that a stranger is holding your home address in his hand." He paused. 340 times, Mr. Kessler." She sat with that feeling 340 times. "Tonight, you only have to do it once. Consider us even." He hung up. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Dale Whitmore processed the payment through the system. 11 cents on the dollar, paid to Cascade Recovery Partners, along with the transfer of the entire account. It wasn't a large sum. In the accounting records of Halloway Marine Logistics that week, it sat between a crane maintenance invoice and an insurance advance, and unless someone went looking for it, no one would ever notice it. Elias Ward was looking. He had been looking for 3 years, not through Halloway's own books, but through the places where money flowed out of Halloway, because that was where a man revealed himself, not where the money flowed in. He had people inside 4 companies. Cascade Recovery Partners was one of them. On Monday morning, a woman working in the accounting department in Kent sent a message containing 12 words and a screenshot. Elias Ward read it in the car on his way to breakfast. He didn't need to know who Voss was. He didn't care who Voss was. He only looked at the number, then at the name of the buyer, then stared through the window for about 10 seconds. Rowan Halloway had used his own money to purchase one individual's entire debt. Not a company, not a business partner, a human being with a first name and a last name. For 3 years, Elias Ward had searched for a place to drive a blade into a man who seemed to have nowhere vulnerable enough to strike. And on that Monday morning, sitting in the car with the phone in his hand, he found one that Saturday. The autumn fair in Puyallup opened at 10 o'clock in the morning. Rowan Holloway knew because he had told Dale Whitmore to look into it, and he had asked Dale to do something that made the older man ask twice before believing he had heard correctly. An envelope was delivered to the Yellow House in Tacoma on Wednesday, addressed to Mrs. Patricia Voss. Inside were 3 all-day fair tickets and a printed note explaining that they were a customer appreciation gift from a life insurance company. There was no insurance company. Patricia Voss was 71 years old, had paid for life insurance for 30 years, and had never been appreciated by anyone, so she believed it immediately. On Saturday morning, she took her granddaughter out at 9 o'clock, carrying a box of sandwiches and a folded raincoat in her bag, and she told Marin over the phone, "You get some sleep. I'll take her out and we won't be back until this afternoon." That was the only reason in the world, that the house was empty that afternoon. Rowan drove down to Tacoma at 3 o'clock. On the passenger seat lay a stack of papers inside a clear plastic folder. Not a check, not money. It was written confirmation that every debt obligation under Marin Voss's name had been discharged, all 3 pieces consolidated into one, bearing Barry Kessler's signature and a notary seal. He drove himself, without a chauffeur, and he rehearsed his opening sentence 3 times on the way, and none of them sounded right. The rain began as he crossed the bridge. He parked in front of the butter yellow house, the low white wooden fence, the yard no bigger than a rug, the silver sedan in the driveway. He picked up the papers, passed through the gate, and climbed the 3 wooden porch steps, the very porch where 1 week earlier he had sat in his car 4 houses away, and told himself he had no right to set foot. The door stood open, not slightly ajar, open by the width of 2 finger joints, and along the bottom edge, a streak of mud stretched from outside into the house. Rowan stood still for exactly 1 second. Then he pushed the door open. The rest had already been told. The woman sitting on the floor, the yellow rope, the red papers scattered everywhere, the shake of her head. But what the hook hadn't told was what happened during the next 3 seconds. Rowan didn't freeze in horror. He froze because he was reading the room. 18 years in his profession had taught him that when you entered a place where something was wrong, the first thing you did wasn't run toward the victim. It was identify what made the place wrong. He saw her shake her head. He followed her gaze. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking past his shoulder, toward the right, toward the darkness behind the door he had just pushed open. He shifted to the left. The door slammed into the place where he had been standing. It rebounded against the wall, and a man lunged out of the darkness, and Rowan didn't have time to see his face. He saw only the mass of a body and an arm swinging upward. He didn't step back. Stepping back meant dying. He drove forward. The 2 men collided into a hallway less than 5 feet wide, and both of them crashed sideways into a small table against the wall, the table that held a bowl of keys and a framed photograph. One of the table legs snapped. It collapsed. The bowl of keys flew across the floor, the picture frame slid down, and the glass shattered. The house was dark because of the rain, and because no one had turned on the lights, so all that could be heard was breathing, wood breaking, and shoes grinding against the floor. Rowan caught the man's collar. The man grabbed Rowan's arm. They staggered backward 3 steps and struck the shoe cabinet. Neither said a word. People didn't speak during moments like that. That only happened in movies. The coffee table in the living room tipped over when they rolled across it, and the papers on top flew into the air before falling like leaves. Rowan was broader and driven by a cold, quiet fury and more than 20 pounds heavier, and in the end, that was the whole story. He drove the man against the base of the wall and pinned him there, and 3 seconds later, the man stopped struggling. Rowan held him in place. He was breathing hard. His ears were ringing. Then he looked down at the man's face. He didn't know it. It was an ordinary face, around 35 years old, nothing memorable, the kind of face people hired to do things the person stripping didn't want to do himself. "Who sent you?" Rowan asked. The man didn't answer. Rowan looked across the floor, and then he understood. The papers scattered everywhere hadn't been thrown into the air during the struggle. They had already been there. The entire room had been searched. Cabinet drawers had been pulled open, sofa cushions overturned. Even the refrigerator door stood slightly open. No one searched a house like this for money, because one look around told anyone there was no money here. People searched like this when they were looking for a piece of paper. Rowan turned toward Marin. She had managed to shift herself against the leg of the sofa. The tape still covered her mouth, and she was staring at one place, fixed and unblinking, and Rowan followed her gaze. Beneath the overturned coffee table, mixed among the red papers, lay a brown envelope. It rested there with one edge slightly curled and a fold running through the center. Rowan understood all three things at once, and he understood them so quickly that they seemed to arrive in the same second. First, the man beneath his hands hadn't come there to abduct anyone. Second, he had been there for a long time, long enough to tear apart every corner of the house, and he still hadn't found what he needed because what he needed lay beneath the table 6 feet away, where he hadn't seen it. The third realization was the one that turned Rowan's insides cold. This woman had been sitting on the floor of her own home, with her hands tied, and throughout all that time, she hadn't been watching the door. She had been watching beneath the table. She had been guarding the envelope. She had allowed him to tear apart her home without showing him where it was. Rowan released the man, stood, and as he rose, he kicked the shoe cabinet across the front doorway to block it. Then he pulled out his phone and pressed 2 numbers. 3 men. Yellow House, Ash Street, Tacoma. 10 minutes he crouched beside Marin. He didn't rip the tape away. He peeled it slowly from one edge, and he apologized as he did it. She drew a long breath. "Are you hurt?" "No," her voice was hoarse. "The little girl." "She isn't here," he said immediately. "She's at the fair with her grandmother. They left at 9 o'clock this morning. She'll be back at 5. Marin looked at him. Something passed across her face. "How do you know that?" Rowan didn't answer. He loosened the rope around her wrists. The knot was a workman's knot, tied firmly, and it took him some time. As he worked, he looked at the rope and recognized it. Cargo rope, yellow, twisted in 3 strands. His company imported thousands of coils every month. It was kept in every one of his warehouses along the bay. He freed her hands. She pulled them back and rubbed her wrists, but she didn't look at them. She was still looking beneath the table. Rowan stood. He took 3 steps toward the overturned coffee table, lowered himself onto one knee, and reached underneath. He pulled the brown envelope from among the red papers. It was light. Edge had been torn open once and folded closed again. There was no sender's name, only a Spokane postmark and slanted handwriting. He stood there, holding it in both hands. Behind him, the rain tapped against the roof of the wooden house. In front of him, the woman on the floor said nothing, and she no longer looked at him. She had closed her eyes. Rowan Holloway lifted the envelope from the floor. He hadn't opened it. The man beneath Rowan's hands that afternoon gave up a name within 40 minutes, and the name surprised no one. On Sunday night, Elias Ward walked out of a restaurant in Belltown at 11 o'clock and never reached his car. No one saw anything. There was no sound. Terminal 18 stood at the end of an artificial peninsula extending into the bay, and in its northeastern corner was a row of old containers no one used anymore. 40-foot steel boxes that had reached the end of their working lives, stacked 2 levels high while they waited to be sold for scrap. The 9th one from the left had a single incandescent bulb fitted to the ceiling and a lock that still worked. There was nothing else. No chair, no water, nothing at all. Rowan didn't hit him. No one hit him. They brought him there at midnight, and Rowan followed him inside, stood in the middle of that steel box for about a minute with his hands in his pockets, watching Elias Ward sit on the metal floor, with both wrists bound in front of his stomach. "It's been 3 years since I last saw you," Rowan said. Ward laughed. "What are you going to do to me?" "Nothing." Rowan turned toward the door. He reached for the switch beside the frame. "Holloway, I turned off the light. The container had no windows, no cracks, nothing at all. The darkness inside a 40-foot steel box wasn't like the darkness inside a room. It had no shade and no shape. It was simply the substance of everything, and it covered a man's eyes like a hand." Rowan pulled the heavy steel door shut. He locked it. He left. 6 hours. He went home, showered, changed his clothes, sat in his study, and couldn't read a single line of the contract lying open before him. At 6 o'clock on a Monday morning, he returned to the port. His men stood about 100 feet away smoking, and one of them, Owen Pratt, 39 years old and employed by the family for 12 years, walked over. "What are you planning to do with him?" "Open the door first," the steel door groaned. Morning light poured into the container. and Elias Ward was still sitting in exactly the same place where he had been at midnight. He hadn't moved an inch. He raised one hand to shield his eyes, and that hand was trembling. He looked at Rowan. Then he began to speak. He spoke for 45 minutes without stopping. No one had to ask him anything. The words poured out of him like vomit, and halfway through, his voice broke and he had to pause. Rowan stood there and listened to everything, his hands in his pockets, taking no notes and never interrupting. By the time Ward finished, the sun had risen above the Cascade Mountains and the entire harbor shone white. Rowan stepped outside. Owen Pratt followed. "Did he tell us everything, sir? Almost everything? Almost? There's one place he's still hiding." "He's hiding it because he's more afraid of that place than he is of me." Owen nodded. He thought for about 3 seconds, then said what anyone in that profession would have said. Not because he was cruel, but because he had worked in that profession for 12 years and it was a tool already waiting inside the box. "He has a daughter in Blue. She's 22. If you want him to tell us the rest, all we have to do is..." Rowan turned his head. He didn't shout. His expression didn't change. Owen, "Yes, sir, did you hear me, sir? That day at Warehouse Sadson. Were you there?" Owen said nothing. "You were there, I remember. I said it once, and I told you I would only say it one more time." Rowan stepped closer. "We don't touch family, not wives, not children, not elderly mothers, no one. The man lying loud inside that container sent someone into a woman's home and had her tied up in the middle of the day. And that is exactly why he is inside the container while I am standing out here. If I do what you just suggested, what makes me different from him? That I own more cars?" Owen Pratt lowered his head. "I'm sorry, sir. That line isn't there for decoration. It is the only reason this place has remained in standing for 30 years. The day we erase it, every man in this city will understand that his home is no longer safe. And then no one will have anything left to lose. And you won't want to live in that city." He turned away. "Call Freeman at the federal office. Tell him I have something for them. Then give Ward breakfast, give him a coat, and don't touch him." On Monday evening, Maren Voss returned for her night shift. She arrived earlier than usual. Rowan met her in the kitchen at 9 o'clock while she was washing her hands at the sink, and he stood in the doorway holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. "How are your wrists?" "They're fine." She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands with a paper towel, folded the towel into quarters, and dropped it into the trash. Then she turned to face him. "What did you do to him?" Rowan looked at her. On the drive home from the port, he had prepared 3 different answers, all 3 of them clean and all 3 of them acceptable. He gave her a 4th. "I left him alone," he said, "for 6 hours. Inside a steel container with no light, no windows, and no one speaking to him. Maren didn't move. I didn't hit him. I didn't let anyone hit him. I only turned off the light and walked out." He looked down at the coffee cup in his hand. "It's the worst thing I know." Neither of them spoke for a while. The vast kitchen was so quiet that they could hear the refrigerator running. Then Maren did something Rowan didn't understand at first. She didn't look at him. She lifted her eyes and looked over his shoulder toward the kitchen ceiling, toward the left corner. The corner that, if one traveled straight upward, would lead to the end of a thickly carpeted hallway, to the 3rd door on the right, to a room where a machine made noise all day, and a window hadn't been opened in 3 years. She stared up there for a very long time. Rowan turned his head and followed her gaze. He looked at the corner of the kitchen ceiling. Then he looked back at her, and she saw it. She saw it pass across his face, quickly, for less than a second. The thing a man couldn't hide when he had just heard his own words echo back from a place where he didn't want them to return. He said nothing. Neither did she. But standing in that kitchen at 9 o'clock that night, Maren Voss understood something that chilled her more deeply than anything that had happened on Saturday. This man knew. He knew exactly what the thing he had done to Elias Ward was called. He knew it was the heaviest one person could place upon another. He knew it so well that he had chosen it instead of every other tool in his box. And he had allowed his own brother to sit inside that punishment for 3 years. The place Elias Ward had been hiding was revealed to Rowan Halloway on Wednesday afternoon, and he didn't learn it from Ward. He learned it from his brother. The family council met in the formal dining room at 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't an official name. There were no bylaws, and no one had ever elected anyone. It was simply 7 men and 1 woman who had been sitting around that walnut table since Rowan's father was alive. People who held interests in the ports. people who had earned the right to be heard when something serious happened. Rowan had summoned them because he needed a decision about Ward. At 3:15, the dining room door opened. Owen Pratt pushed in a wheelchair. The entire table fell silent. No one in that room had seen Beckett Halloway in 3 years. They knew he was alive. They sent flowers during the holidays. They asked after him, in the tone people used when asking about something that had already become part of the past. Now he sat at the head of the table beneath the chandelier, his hair combed to one side, wearing a collared shirt someone had buttoned all the way to his throat. Sloane Kestrel sat in the third chair on the right. She didn't move. Rowan looked at his brother. "You said you had something to tell us," Beckett nodded. He nodded very slowly. Then he began, and his voice was faint and hoarse, every word forced to wait for the machine to push a breath into him before it could come out, and all 7 men and 1 woman around the table had to lean forward to hear. "That night," Beckett said, "I was sitting in the car first. No one spoke. You told me to get into the car while you came out afterward. You were still inside the house, talking on the phone. Rowan didn't move. I was in the passenger seat. The engine wasn't running. The window was down because I was smoking. 1 breath. Someone was speaking on the phone outside on the porch. Another breath. It wasn't you. You were inside." The room began to understand. Not all at once, but one person after another until they stopped breathing. "It was a woman's voice," Beckett said. He didn't look toward the third chair on the right. He didn't need to. She said 3 sentences. I heard 2 of them. The first was, "It's about to come out." The second was, "I can't do this anymore. Don't make me do it anymore." A long breath. The entire table waited. Then she ended the call and went back inside. 4 minutes later, "You came out." He stopped. Rowan looked directly into his brother's face and saw nothing there. No anger, no accusation. Only a 29-year-old man, concentrating every bit of strength left in his body on pushing each word through his throat. 3 years, a man at the far end of the table said. His voice trembled. "Why didn't you say anything for 3 years?" Beckett turned his head toward him. It took him 4 seconds. "Do you know how long it takes me to say 1 sentence?" No one answered. 40 seconds, Beckett said. For 1 sentence. 40 seconds, including the time I have to wait for the machine. He drew another breath. "Now imagine me sitting at this table 3 years ago, and it takes me 40 seconds to say the first word of my brother's fiancée's name. Then another 40 seconds for the next word. Then another 40 seconds after that. 1 breath. By the 200th second, how many people at this table would still be listening? Or would you already be looking at one another? Would someone say, 'He's tired, let him rest, we can continue tomorrow'?" No one dared look at anyone else. "I wasn't silent because I was afraid," Beckett said. "I was silent because I knew what would happen. People would listen to all of it. They would nod. Then they would leave the room and tell one another that the poor boy had been lying still too long, that his mind wasn't what it used to be." Rowan closed his eyes. "For 3 years, I lay in that bed," Beckett said, "and every time someone walked into the room, I thought, this time I'll tell them." Then they would ask whether I was in pain. Then they wouldn't wait. They would ask and immediately keep talking. They would tell me about their own lives, tell me to sleep, then walk out. Because waiting for me to answer took too long. And everyone was busy. The dining room was so quiet that the clock in the next room could be heard. "Then someone came," Beckett said. His voice broke on the word at someone, and he had to wait through brutes from the machine before he could continue. "She asked me whether I was in pain." 1 breath. Then she sat in silence. She didn't guess for me. She didn't speak for me. She sat there for 40 seconds, 80 seconds, 2 minutes, until I had finished. He looked directly at his brother. "For 3 years, no one waited for me, Rowan. Then one person did." He drew one final breath. "So now I'm speaking." The third chair on the right scraped against the floor. Sloane Kestrel stood. Everyone at the table turned toward her. She didn't run. She didn't deny it. She stood there with one gloved hand resting on the back of the chair, and there was nothing on her face, no fear, no anger, only the emptiness of someone who had finally put down something she had carried for too long. Rowan rose. "How much?" he said. "Tell me how much he paid you." Sloane looked at him, then she laughed. It wasn't the glub smile. It was twisted and ugly, and it was the truest thing anyone in that room had ever seen on her face. "You think it was money," she said. She pulled off the glove on her left hand. She did it slowly, 1 finger at a time, and no one understood why until she turned her wrist upward. There was a small, old, faded tattoo there, 2 letters woven together. My sister's name was Nell, Sloane said. She disappeared in Portland 5 years ago. My entire family held a memorial service for her. My father stood up and delivered the eulogy. She put the glove back on. 3 years ago, Elias Ward sent me a photograph. It had been taken that same day. She was holding that day's newspaper. No one in the room breathed. From that day until now, I have received another photograph every 3 months. She looked around the walnut table at the 7 faces staring back at her, and her voice was perfectly ordinary. You're all sitting here thinking I sold you for money. I wish it had been money. Because if it had been money, I could have stopped. That afternoon, after everyone had left, after the federal agents had arrived, Rowan Holloway stood alone on the back porch looking down toward the bay. Marin came and stood beside him. She had remained in the kitchen doorway throughout the meeting. She had heard everything. What are you going to do with her? Marin asked. She let my brother sit in that car. She knew beforehand, and she let him sit there. Yes, she cut your wages. She threatened you with my license. She knew where you had been sleeping for 7 months and didn't say a word to anyone. Yes, Marin said. She did all of it. None of it can be erased, Rowan nodded. Then I don't understand what you're trying to say. Marin looked down at the gray water. I'm trying to say that this afternoon, I stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to a woman say she did terrible things to keep a member of her family alive. She turned and looked at him, and I realized I had heard that sentence in it before. I heard it in this kitchen on Monday night, from someone else. Rowan turned his head toward her. The two of you are frighteningly alike, Mr. Holloway, Marin said. There is only one difference. She had already been driven that far. You haven't. Not yet. The brown envelope had been lying in the drawer of Rowan Holloway's desk since Saturday afternoon. He hadn't opened it because it didn't belong to him. He had told himself that for 4 straight days, and during those 4 days, he opened the drawer 9 times, and all 9 times he closed it again. On Friday afternoon, after federal agents escorted Sloane Kestrel out of the house through the front door at 4 o'clock, after the council had dispersed, after that enormous house had sunk into a silence completely different from its usual silence, Rowan went down to the garage, climbed into the old car, and took the envelope with him. He didn't know where he intended to drive. He didn't start the engine. He sat inside the dark garage with the lights off and the rolling door closed, and he tore open the edge of the envelope. There were 4 pages inside. The first was a handwritten letter from a man named Harlan Boyd, written in slanted script. It was brief. It said he was deeply sorry it had taken him 2 years to find the answer, that what she was holding was a complete copy, that he hadn't charged her another $1 for the final 3 months, and that if she needed someone to sit beside her while she read it, he was willing to drive down from Spokane. Rowan turned the page. The second sheet was a photocopy. It was a form belonging to an industrial cleanup company called Puget Environmental Services, a name that sounded very clean, one of 40 small companies in which his family held an ownership interest and never mentioned. There was a date at the top of the page. Rowan looked at that date, and he didn't need to read anything else. 3 years earlier, September, he continued. Scene remediation request. Location: all vehicles and materials within the designated radius. Method of disposal. One line recorded the time the order had been issued, 3:14 in the morning, and in the lower right corner was a signature. Rowan stared at it for a very long time. He knew it. It was the signature he had written thousands of times in his life, 2 initials followed by 1 long stroke. The mark his father had taught him to sign when he was 16 and had told him, "You only sign this when you are certain." At 3:14 in the morning, 3 years earlier, Rowan Holloway, 31 years old, had been standing in a hospital corridor while his brother was being wheeled through 2 doors no one would allow him to follow. There was blood on his shirt, blood on his hands dried brown beneath his fingernails. Someone had handed him a telephone. Someone had told him the scene was still untouched, that the police would arrive in 4 hours, that there were things there which, if discovered, would bring down the entire house. And he, 31 years old, with his younger brother's blood still on his hands, had spoken 3 words. Clean it all. He hadn't asked what was at the scene. He hadn't asked whether anyone was there. He hadn't asked because the only image inside his mind was his brother lying on a stretcher, while someone in blue went down on his chest. And he had sized his name, lowered the telephone, and sat on the hospital corridor floor for 4 hours. He turned to the 3rd page. It was an inventory. A list of everything disposed of at the scene that night. It contained 3 entries. The first was a car. The second was debris. The third was an ambulance, with its unit number and license plate, belonging to a private ambulance service called South Sound, which had arrived at the scene at 2:51 in the morning. Rowan stopped breathing. He turned to the 4th page. It was a printed roster of the South Sound employees working that night. 2 columns, one for names and one for vehicle numbers. One name had been circled in pencil. The circle was faint and trembling, not drawn by Harlan Boyd. It had been made by someone who had held that page inside a car in the rain and circled the name with her own hand. Voss D. Rowan Holloway sat in the darkness of that garage without moving a single muscle. 3:14 in the morning. He had ordered the scene erased at 3:14 in the morning, and the ambulance had arrived at 2:51. It had been there for 23 minutes before he spoke those 3 words. He hadn't known. He hadn't known, and that was precisely the problem, because not knowing wasn't an excuse. It was an indictment. He hadn't asked. Someone had handed him a telephone, and he had ordered the destruction of a place he had never seen, and he had believed those 3 words would touch nothing but steel and machinery. He lowered the 4 pages onto his lap, and then it came, all of it at once, like a door bursting open. The badge, the plastic badge hanging from the rearview mirror of the silver sedan, expired 2 years earlier. The thing he had watched for 40 minutes beneath maple trees at 3:00 o'clock in the morning, without understanding what it meant. Now he understood. People didn't hang their own employee badges from the rearview mirror. They hung someone else's. They placed it in the exact spot where they would have to see it every time they lifted their eyes. And they did it not because they remembered, but because they were afraid that one day they might forget. 14 months. A nurse with 8 years of experience and a spotless license. Someone who could have found work at any hospital in the state with regular hours and higher pay, had applied for a private night shift caring for a paralyzed patient. In whose private home? He remembered the old car creeping past the port fence at 4 o'clock in the morning, on the night he dealt with Curtis Pell. He remembered her face in the kitchen at 9 o'clock at night, when he told her he had left Ward alone for 6 hours, and the way she had raised her eyes toward the corner of the ceiling. He remembered her sitting on the floor of her house in Tacoma, Homer, with her hands bound, and she had been watching the door. She had been guarding the space beneath the table. She had allowed a man to tear apart her entire home, rather than show him where these pages were hidden. And he remembered the rain, the cramped car, his knees pressed against the glove compartment, and a woman who had finished reading these 4 pages 15 minutes earlier, who had been sitting on them beneath her own thigh, looking up at him and saying, "I'm very good at choosing the wrong people to save." He had frowned. He had said, "I don't understand," and she had replied, "Yes, you don't." She hadn't wandered into his house by accident. She had spent 2 years searching for him. She had sold her apartment to pay an old man in Spokane to find him. She had slept in a car 400 yards from his gate every night for 7 months, so she could remain close enough to discover the truth. And she had been right to suspect him. Rowan sat in the dark garage until his hands stopped trembling. Then he looked at the clock on the dashboard. 6:10. Tonight was the annual gala at the Chihuly Museum. 300 guests, 4 newspapers. The gala after which, 11 days earlier, he had promised her that everything in that house would be different. He knew exactly what would happen if he went there and did what he intended to do. He knew that when he finished speaking, this woman would walk out of his life, and she would have every right, and he wouldn't have a single word with which to ask her to stay. He placed the 4 pages back inside the envelope. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. Then he started the engine, raised the rolling door, and drove away from the largest house on Magnolia Hill toward the city. The Chihuly Museum that night was a forest of glass. Hand-blown clusters hung from the ceiling of the glass house, red, orange, and gold, while 300 people stood beneath them, holding champagne glasses and looking upward as though they owned a share of what they saw. Rowan Holloway entered at 10 minutes before 8. He didn't remove his coat. He moved through the crowd without stopping to shake anyone's hand, and he went straight to the corner where the quartet was playing. He didn't take the microphone. He bent down and pulled the plug from the wall. The sound died. It didn't fade. It died instantly, and all 300 people turned their heads at once with the animal instinct that comes when a familiar sound suddenly disappears. Rowan stood in the middle of the tiled floor beneath the red glass ceiling, and he spoke in his ordinary voice, and the entire room heard every word. "I am ending the engagement," he said. No one breathed. "Sloane Kestrel will not marry me. It ended this afternoon. You will read about it in the newspapers 2 days from now. So I am saying it here, in front of all of you, so you hear it correctly instead of hearing it through someone else." He didn't look at anyone in particular. "For 3 years she sold my shipping routes to Elias Ward. 3 years ago, she knew something was about to happen to my brother, and she said nothing. I do not forgive her for that. I will not forgive her for as long as I live." He paused. "And I will tell you the rest, because next week someone will write an article about this, and they will only write half of it. Elias Ward has been holding her sister for 5 years. Her family held a memorial service for the girl. Every 3 months he sent Sloane a photograph. Somewhere behind him a glass fell. That does not erase what she did. It does not erase a single word of it. But if any of you intend to call her a money-hungry opportunist, then you will be calling her the wrong thing. And I do not like people getting things wrong." 2 people in dark suits stood at the eastern entrance. They weren't in a hurry. Sloane Kestrel placed her glass on a high table, removed the glove from her left hand, and held it in her fingers. She walked toward them on her own, her head raised, moving through the path that opened between 300 people, and she didn't look at Rowan even once. The door closed behind her. Rowan remained standing in the middle of the room. He knew that if he stopped there, everything else would remain untouched. He knew exactly what the next sentence would cost. He had calculated it for 2 hours in the dark garage, had calculated it again and again, and the price never changed. He said it. "There is one more thing," Rowan said. "For the past 14 months, a woman has worked the night shift in my house. She cares for my brother. She is the only person in that house and sits and waits for him to finish a sentence. None of you knows her name, and for 14 months neither did I." He looked around the room. "Her name is Mafia Bosses." He said nothing else. He didn't explain. 300 people stood beneath the forest of glass, and none of them knew what to do with that name, and because of that, it remained in the room, heavy and unable to go anywhere. She was standing on the rear terrace, where the exit overlooked the lawn, alone. She wore her old coat. She had been there before he cut off the music, stepped outside. He closed the glass door behind him, and the noise from inside was reduced by half. Marin didn't turn around. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters. Without looking at him, she extended it behind her. Rowan took it. He didn't need to open it. He knew which page it was. "You signed this," she said. "Yes, at 3:14 in the morning. Yes, you didn't ask whether anyone was there." "No," he answered immediately. There wasn't a second between the question and the answer. Not one word placed between them. No 31-year-old man. No blood on his hands. No hospital corridor. None of the things he had spent 2 hours arranging inside his head in the dark garage. "No, I didn't ask." Marin turned around. Her face was wet. She allowed it to remain wet. "Do you know what his name was?" Rowan Holloway stood there on the rear terrace of a museum, and he spoke the name. Daniel Voss. He had never said it aloud before. For 3 years, that man had existed only as a line in the third entry of an inventory, and tonight, for the first time, Rowan opened his mouth and the name fell into the air, and there it remained between them, and neither of them could ever pick it up again. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask her to forgive him. He stood still and allowed the silence to finish what remained. Maren Voss didn't forgive Rowan Holloway. 6 months had passed, and she still hadn't forgiven him, and perhaps she never would. And both of them knew it. She didn't marry him either. People in Seattle whispered about many things during that winter, but none of them were true. The truth was much simpler. She continued working. She accepted exactly the amount written in her contract, not 1 penny more, and she stood inside the 4th floor office and made that perfectly clear to Dale Whitmore, telling him that if any payment appeared outside the official payroll, she would resign the very next day. She worked 5 nights a week. She left her job in Burien and rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in Ballard on the 3rd floor, with 1 window overlooking the parking spaces, and Wynne slept in the inner bedroom. She didn't stay because of Rowan. She stayed because there was a 29-year-old man on the 2nd floor who needed someone willing to sit and wait until he finished speaking. And, during those 6 months, she asked herself many times whether she had stayed for him or for herself. She never found the answer. and eventually she decided that the answer mattered less than simply being there. Beckett Halloway was the one who forgave her. He did it one afternoon in February, when Marin sat beside his bed and told him everything from the beginning, about the badge hanging from the rearview mirror, about the old man in Spokane, about the 2 years she had spent suspecting that house, suspecting his brother, and suspecting Beckett himself. When she finished, she sat silently and waited for him to tell her to leave. It took Beckett nearly a full minute to force his answer through his throat. He told her that during the 3 years he had spent lying in that bed, he had learned one thing. Everyone who walked into his room arrived carrying a judgment that had already been written. Some said he was pitiful. Some said he was lucky to be alive. Some told him he needed to stay strong. He told her that she had entered the room carrying a judgment too, but she was the only person willing to tear hers apart. He told her she was the only person in that house who had asked whether he was in pain and then waited. 6 months after the night at the museum, a small foundation opened in Seattle. It was called the Voss Foundation. It held no galas, displayed no gold plaques, and invited no one to take photographs while a ribbon was cut. It did exactly one thing. It paid the debts of families whose medical workers had died in the line of duty: ambulance drivers, emergency medical technicians, nurses working night shifts, people whose insurance claims were often denied because of some technical clause. During its first year, it helped 11 families. Not one of those 11 families knew where the money had come from. On a clear afternoon in May, Beckett Halloway wheeled himself onto the back porch for the first time. It took him 18 minutes to cross 9 meters, and no one helped him because he had warned them beforehand that no one was allowed to help. Marin stood beside the glass door and counted every meter. When he finally reached the porch, the sunlight stretched across Elliott Bay in a silver ribbon, and on the open window frame above his head, 9 bottle caps threaded onto fishing line clattered in the wind, crooked and uneven, forming no melody at all. Then came the sound of footsteps running across the grass. Win Voss, 7 years old, raced across the lawn with both hands full of dandelions, then stopped sharply in front of the wheelchair, and studied this as sitting there with the solemn gaze of a child, confirming something she had heard about many times. She asked whether he was the man who lived in the big house. It took Beckett 40 seconds to answer that he was. The little girl didn't go anywhere. She stood there and waited through all 40 seconds, then nodded with great satisfaction and told him that she had made the wind chime and asked whether he could hear it, and Beckett told her he listened to it all the time. Rowan Halloway stood inside the house behind the glass door and watched. He didn't step outside. That afternoon, Marin passed him on her way into the kitchen, and he said her name, only her name, and she stopped for 1 second before continuing on. That was all he had, and he knew it was all he would ever have, and he lived with that knowledge every day for the rest of his life. Some things in this world can't be redeemed. A person can only continue living in a way that proves worthy of the price someone else paid for them. And sometimes there's the going for the interworld, the woman who has no one caring for them. So if you meet someone like that today, please ask them a question, and then wait for their answer. If this story touched you, please leave a like, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Which detail made you pause the longest? Please leave a comment because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.